Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Ambassador from Palestine is here with us, the Ambassador from Algeria too. Thank you very much for being here with us. And for those of you who prefer to follow this dialogue in Spanish, there is simultaneous interpreting. So you can just find headsets just outside the room so that you can follow the simultaneous interpreting. We have come together another year in Casa Árabe in order to commemorate the Nakba, which is the leaving of many refugees from Palestine who had to abandon their country at the beginning of the 20th century, but mainly due to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. When this unleashed the first war between Israel and Arab countries. The Palestinians left and they had to abandon their homes, leaving everything behind, their jobs, their homes, with the hope of being able to return soon to their homes until they realized that they would not be returning. And this meant that more than 700,000 Palestinians had to remain away from their homes permanently with the dream of being able to return one day. And that first immigration has been many Palestinians who have had to leave their homeland due to a lack of hope, because the situation, rather than improving, has actually worsened over the years. And as a result of that, they have had to abandon their country. So all over the world, there are many colonies of Palestinians in general, people who are in general very successful because there are people who have high-level qualifications and education, as many of you are aware, and they're away from their homes, often with divided families. Some of their family members remained within Israel or in the occupied territories, and others are elsewhere throughout the world. The conflict that is being seen over the last few days in the region is only putting the focus on the dramatic situation that these people are living through, in particular those from the interior who are suffering the battering from the military. And there have been a great deal, many fatal victims on the one hand, and fundamentally, well, it's on both sides, but most of the victims are from the Palestinian side, many fatalities and many injured people. And this conflict has put an end to those who speculated that the conflict could be solved spontaneously with no negotiations, with no intervention on behalf of politicians to ensure that they sat round and negotiated the future of Palestinians. As I said, this conflict has underlined the fact that this is not the case, because the problem continues to be deeply rooted and it simply just unleashes itself very strongly each time. And so I think that once again, we are seeing the urgency in going back to the negotiating table to comply with the UN resolutions and to be able to create two states that can live in harmony, that can coexist next to each other, bringing peace to both countries, because the Israelis are a victim too of their own policies. And the Israeli citizens have no peace either, obviously. So to talk about this today, we have with us a very distinguished Palestinian, and I'm sure all of you know her, or at least her name will ring a bell, Miss Hanan Ashrawi. Miss Ashrawi, I'd like to thank you ever so much on behalf of Casa Árabe for being here with us today at such a crucial, critical time for the lives of Palestinians, and for having agreed to be with us this evening. Miss Ashrawi is a member of the Palestine Liberation Organization. She was a former member of the Palestine Liberation Organization during the Middle East peace process, starting with the conference in Madrid in 1991. She has been the first woman in occupying a position at the high executive level in Palestine. She was elected member of the OLP, Palestinian Liberation Organization, in 2009, and more recently in 2018, she had stepped down at the end of last year. And in 1996, Ms. Ashrawi was appointed Minister of Education, Higher Education and Research of the Palestinian Authority, and she was part of the executive body up until 1996 and re-elected for the Third Way bloc in 2006. As an activist of the civil society, she has founded the so-called Independent Committee for Human Rights, the Palestine Initiative for Global Dialogue and Democracy, and the National Coalition for the Responsibility and Liability and Integrity. She has received many awards all over the world and many academic distinctions. Thank you ever so much, Ms. Ashrawi, for being here with us. And we have here with us too the ambassador from Palestine in Madrid. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for being here with us. And the debate with Ms. Ashrawi will be carried out by José Vericat, who's a well-known person for those of us who are involved in Middle East matters in the Palestine world. And currently he's an advisor of the European Institute for Peace. And he is a great expert in the Middle East with more than 2 decades of experience working in different areas of the conflict. I think 12 years in total working in Palestine. And he's been a director of the field office, the Carter Center. And he was also an advisor for Middle East at the International Institute for Peace. And he has worked too as a journalist, and he has received several awards and has a doctorate in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford and a master in International Relations from the University of Columbia. And so he's the most suited person to accompany Ms. Hanan Ashrawi of today in this conversation. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to the ambassador from Palestine. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Pedro Martínez-Avial, thank you for the invite. It's a great honor to be here sharing this panel with the illustrious ambassador from Palestine. Thank you for Hanan Ashrawi and the rest of the team in Casa Árabe for organizing and inviting me to this event. It's a great honor to be here. I apologize, I didn't have my microphone on. It's a great honor, says the speaker, to be here in conversation with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, such a distinguished and well-known person. And at the same time, this is a doubly solemn time because it is the difficult anniversary to remember. The Nakba is even worse in current times because of what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and in particular in the Gaza Strip, in particular, where up until now almost 200 people have unfortunately died, and there is a huge amount of destruction to homes and infrastructures in the territory there, which has already been badly damaged after so many wars. I'm going to go into speak in English now, and I will continue this conversation with Hanan Ashrawi in English, and hopefully the simultaneous interpreting will work correctly.
So it's, as I said, I'd like to later perhaps speak to her about what happened, if we have enough time, since then, and whether we can look forward to another transformational moment like that. But of course, today we're here to talk about the Nakba. And I'd like to start off by addressing the Nakba. I'm sure we're eager to also speak about other issues that are happening and developments and Professor Ashrawi's analysis and interpretation of those developments. But Professor Ashrawi is first and foremost an academic. She is a professor of literature. She is, in fact, an expert in medieval literature, English literature. And from that perspective, as well as a politician, but perhaps from that perspective, Professor, I'd like to ask you, what is the meaning for you of the Nakba?
Spanish, and I've been trying to tell you I cannot hear the English, and now that I can hear some English, the Spanish translation is louder than the English. Would you please have somebody fix it?
You can speak in English, Doctora.
I'm trying to speak in English, but I hear the Spanish interpretation coming through, and I haven't heard anything except Spanish. And the interpretation now, I hear what I say is being translated very loud. Could you please fix this? I don't want to hear the translation. Spanish. And I didn't hear anything of what anybody said before, except Spanish.
I think there is a button on Zoom, Dr.
I'm using this button and I say English.
You've pressed the button and it's still not working.
It just gives me Spanish.
You can only hear Spanish. Oh dear. I'm sorry, we're trying to fix it.
Yeah, even when I speak, I hear the Spanish interpretation. It's louder than my voice.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear my English now?
I can hear you, but it's in the background.
Oh dear.
And the foreground is the Spanish interpretation and it's very loud.
Oh dear.
I hear interpretations of my own voice, of what I'm saying.
Okay. Maybe we can, I can ask the interpreters to stop interpreting and I can speak English and then, they can translate after I speak. Perhaps that would be a way?
I don't know. I mean, this is, obviously there's a technical problem.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is anyone cannot speak, cannot understand English in the audience? Because if it's not the case, we can just do the whole conference in English.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And
yeah, the people online might suffer.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, the problem.
Silence the original on the Zoom.
Is she pressing the silence button on Zoom?
Silence the original.
Silence the original. You can press silence the original, perhaps?
Yes, I press silence the original.
Okay, and now, is that working better?
Let's see. Now it says idioma English. Yes, okay.
Okay.
It's
I
working
pressed it before. It's mute. The original audio is off and it's in English now. Okay.
And can you hear me
Can
now?
you say something?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Are you hearing my English and my Spanish, or just my English right now?
No, now I can hear your English. Okay, fine.
You only hear my English now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Now we can have the conversation.
Now we can start.
So I'm sorry that I didn't get what everybody else said at the beginning.
It can be very brief. I gave an introduction. We're celebrating this year the 30th anniversary of also not only we're remembering the Nakba, we're also in Spain remembering the 30th anniversary of the Madrid conference. And I was highlighting your role in 1991 and in the Madrid conference as official spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation, and I shared with the audience a couple of anecdotes about your conversation with Haider Abdel Shafi about the speech you wrote and how moving it was. And I also highlighted how transformational the Madrid conference was in two respects for the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, in relation to expressing their humanity and in relation to stretching the hand out to Israel for peace. And lastly, to segue into my question about the Nakba, because I know we're anxious to also speak about events on the ground, but segueing into the conversation about the Nakba, I said that you're a literature professor and that uniquely equipped also to understand and interpret the symbolism and the meaning of events. And I wanted to start off by asking you what you thought, what you think is the meaning of the Nakba.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Kifah. I don't know, Ambassador Kifah, if you're there, for your gracious invitation, and Casa Árabe for your, also for your hosting this meeting. And of course, thank you, José. We have seen each other in different incarnations, I guess, when you were here. So it's good to see you again. Let me say, Nakba to us, and actually, if you want to look at it contextually, is an ongoing process. It is not a one-time event. And it's what we're seeing today is, of course, a continuum and one of the most distinctive stages or phases in the Nakba. The Nakba started, people say 1947-48, 73 years since the creation of the State of Israel, which the Palestinians call the disaster, the catastrophe in Nakba, in which the Palestinians were made to suffer a dual injustice. The injustice of dispossession, of being uprooted, of being dispersed, of being expelled, kicked out of their country, to become the largest refugee population in history until recently. And then the second part is the Palestinians who came under the oppression and captivity of the occupation. In 1967, Israel managed to complete its occupation of all of Palestine, all of historical Palestine. So to us, the Nakba, as I said, is a continuum. And it is an implementation of an extremist Zionist ideology, whereby the creation of an exclusivist country for the Jews in Palestine was seen as something that would solve the Western Jewish problem and respond to the European anti-Semitism by creating a state in Palestine. Now, historically, the Nakba started before with the Zionist ideology, with the myth that there is a state without a people, there is a land without a people, for a people without a land. And that myth has continued, has persisted, because they wanted to believe that Palestine is empty, and thereby they started the process of the dehumanization, the negation, the erasure of the Palestinian people, our history, our culture, our narrative, by saying we didn't exist. And if we existed, they labeled us in a stereotypical way as either refugees or terrorists, or primarily non-existent. So this superimposition of a new nation state, which became later a nation state, on an existing historical place called Palestine, is the real Nakba, because it also continued. And what we're seeing is the continuation. When Ilan Pappé wrote in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, he said that this was a displacement-replacement paradigm. We want to remove, the Zionist movement then wanted to remove a whole nation, even demographically and physically, in addition to its culture and history and identity, and replace it with another people. And they started creating a different narrative by excluding the Palestinian narrative, by distorting it, by attempting to take over a new narrative that this was always Israel or a Jewish land, when what they did was, in a sense, attempting to superimpose Greater Israel over all of historical Palestine. Now, this negation meant that they wanted to, in many ways, I said we were a people slated for national obliteration, to be cast outside the course of history, to be told we didn't exist and therefore we had no rights, and therefore Israel can do whatever it wants to us because essentially we are dehumanized and we don't exist. And that mentality and that kind of narrative and distortion has continued. That's why now you see a lot of attempts now at saying that, well, no, when they dehumanize the Palestinians, when they say that they can easily, when they can bomb homes and they can kill hundreds of men, women, and children, they can displace many people, they can uproot them. The whole Zionist project was based on displacing, uprooting the Palestinians. If not the other part, if they couldn't get rid of all of us, then they would try to control and dominate. And as they said, tame us, have us accept our fate as a people who might exist in our little Bantustans, in our little reservations, on our own land, but with Israeli sovereignty and without any rights. So the Nakba has been happening for longer than 73 years, but at the same time, it is symptomatic of the way in which the international community gives Israel preferential treatment, gives it an exemption from abiding by international law or honoring agreements. Actually, when Israel was admitted to the UN in 1948, it was supposed to be admitted on condition, conditionally, on condition that it accepted the return of all the Palestinians who were driven out of their homes, who were expelled, or who were terrorized, the way Palestinians now are being terrorized by the bombing and the shelling and the series of massacres. There were a series of massacres, actually, that led to the refugee crisis. Many of those who stayed were killed, and as a result of all this wanton killing, many people in neighboring villages and so on fled and went into exile and became refugees. And also another pattern of behavior is the razing or this total destruction of villages and cities. Over 500 villages were totally destroyed, erased from the face of the earth. And their names, they attempted to erase their names, or if they built settlements in their place or on their land or next to their land, they would use the Hebrew equivalent of the Arabic name. If you read, again, some of the early historians, the new historians in Israel, they will tell you how this was not by accident, that this was deliberate. It's a competition over who was there, in a sense, who has the continuity over the land, the language, the naming of places, and therefore the control of places. And now we're seeing the same thing happening. Now they are shelling and bombing and destroying homes, whole neighborhoods, the way they did in 2014, where they destroyed a whole district, a whole neighborhood, and murdered thousands. Now they are, again, using the same methods, and they are creating a language and a version, a narrative and a spin that blames the victim, the way they did for years, blaming the Palestinians, labeling us as terrorists, and placing Israel as the victim. This is something that the Zionist ideology has always maintained, that Israel has a monopoly on victimization, and therefore it can do whatever it wants to the Palestinians and get away with it, because they're the victims. And whatever they do to the Palestinians is justified, since we are maligned and labeled and stereotyped and so on, if not also made invisible. And unfortunately, this also increased Israel's impunity, Israel's sense of entitlement, which led to lawlessness and criminality.
Professor.
So I don't want to go into all the phases of how we
Indeed.
got here.
Indeed.
But the most important thing is that this ongoing continuum of Palestinian dispossession and oppression is ongoing. And the only way it can stop is if the international community respects its own mandate, its own international law and international humanitarian law. If there is real intervention in order to stop Israeli violence and violations and atrocities and war crimes. As you know, all these studies that are coming out now, whether from Israeli human rights organizations like Yesh Din or B'Tselem, or from international organizations like Human Rights Watch, saying Israel has created an apartheid system. Israel is committing war crimes and committing crimes against humanity. And these are fully documented documents that should be read very carefully. Because now, unlike 1947-48 or the early days of Zionism, the truth is finally coming out. There are people who are courageous enough and brave enough to speak out, to stand up for Palestine, to deal with the truth, to unlearn all the lies that they have been fed, and to try to stand up for peace and for justice based on international law, based on equality before the law, based on the understanding that the Palestinian people are here to stay, that we have rights, that we have equal rights to everybody else, and that the only way in which you can have peace and justice and stability and security for everybody in the region is by having a just solution to the Palestinian question.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, that painful reminder of what the Nakba means and what the Nakba was, the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians from their villages.
Actually, 800,000.
More like, thank you for that.
But
more like 800,000 from around 600 villages that were either expelled or fled in fear for their lives and their belongings. And the lessons that we have learned from that as a historical moment, and the lessons that Palestinians themselves have learned. We've seen the images in recent weeks of Sheikh Jarrah in the Jerusalem neighborhood under threat, where dozens of houses are under threat of dispossession, being taken over by settler movements. And we've seen the graffiti on the walls saying, "Lan narhal," we will not be expelled, we will not leave. I think that's something that Palestinians, having spent 12 years, the last 2 decades, 12 years living in Israel and Palestine, the last 2 decades following the conflict, I think they've really internalized that. And that's the crunch of the problem, that you've got 6.8 million Palestinians living side by side with 6.8 million Jewish Israelis. And the problem that causes, which is that the conflict endures and those issues need to be addressed. But I also want to ask you about the enduring relevance of the Nakba and about the current, even increasing relevance of the Nakba. I think it's been somehow treated as something of a taboo subject for a very long time, certainly in Western media, certainly in American media. But that taboo is breaking to an extent. We saw this past week, for example, the American intellectual and dare I say Jewish intellectual Peter Beinart writing an article in the New York Times just a few days ago, calling for the return of Palestinian refugees, all of them, to their original villages, and saying that it actually would not be that dramatic an issue, suggesting, that's his opinion, that it would actually be quite feasible, that there would be a lot of compromises, and Palestinians would be very ready for compromises, and saying that that's actually the essence of Jewish theology, of the Jewish spirit, the spirit of exile and return. So, as he argues, if they claim it for themselves, the return, if they have been for thousands of years claiming the return to the promised land, why would they deny it to Palestinians? So as I say, the enduring relevance of the Nakba, the enduring relevance of this catastrophe that happened to the Palestinian people, but even more recently, in more recent years, particularly under the Trump administration, there's been a kind of a demise of the two-state solution, of the promise of the two-state solution, of the viability of the two-state solution. If not a demise, that may be debatable, but certainly very much open to question. A lot of questions have been raised regarding whether the two-state solution is still viable. And with that, again, the open wound of the Nakba, of the origins of the conflict being opened up and being raised, the real origins of the foundations of the conflict really being raised back and put back on the table. And ironically, perhaps, under the Trump administration that tried so hard to get rid of UNRWA, the direct attacks on the refugee agency, trying to cut off Jerusalem from the Palestinians, from Palestinian identity, as if that were possible, as if it's conceivable to think of Palestinian identity without Jerusalem. And somehow that, it seems, that has had the opposite effect, raising those questions, again, of the very foundations of the conflict, and making people think, well, if we can't have a state, if even America, the United States, is not a neutral broker here, and we're not allowed to have anything resembling a state, then we don't want a state. We want equal citizenship. We want equal rights in one state. How do you see that? Do you think that there's the chances of a two-state solution are over? And how do you see the way that the Nakba and events of 1948 have become again extremely relevant?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing this out, because what's happening now is that matters are coming full circle. They're going back to the issue of the basics of the Palestinian question. And as you said, when you mentioned Sheikh Jarrah, this is it. This is why Palestinians will not accept to be uprooted and dispossessed and kicked out of their homes. There is an ongoing process of what we call the Judaization of Jerusalem. Jerusalem in itself has become the core of Israeli aggression, so to speak. It's surrounded, it's besieged by three circles, by three sieges. The siege of the military checkpoints, the siege of the wall, the horrific apartheid wall, and the siege of the settlements that are surrounding it and cutting it off from its Palestinian environment, and of course cutting off or fragmenting the West Bank. So when it became clear that this is what Israel, I mean, it was always clear, but when they moved against the Palestinian Jerusalemites attempting to start the overt ethnic cleansing, not just in Sheikh Jarrah, but you have to remember Silwan. They already have orders to kick out over 80 families from Silwan and take over their property. They have already kicked out Palestinians from within the old city of Jerusalem. The Palestinians felt the brunt, the pain of the Nakba as a living experience. And they said, Jerusalem is ours, it's our history, it's the heart of our reality, our culture, and we will not be kicked out. We will not accept to be dispossessed, dispersed, expelled. So that's one. Two, the graffiti on the wall, yes, very important. We will not leave. We will not be dispossessed or displaced. And again, here we are staying, because people learned that no matter what, even if you stand the chance of being killed, and a very likely possibility, the way, as we said earlier, hundreds of Palestinians, if not thousands, actually thousands, were killed in 1948, and there were whole massacres of villages. I mean, Deir Yassin is the most horrific and known, but there are many other massacres that took place, precisely in order to either force the Palestinians to flee, afraid for their lives, or like in the Lid, which now you're hearing about. In Lid, they also rounded up the people, they rounded up men, they shot them in front of their families, and then they expelled the Palestinians walking on foot from Lid all the way. Most of them came to Ramallah, actually. There's a refugee camp, Jalazon, down the street from my house, where all the original Lid people, had to walk with the Israeli army either shooting or guarding them or beating them up till they came to Ramallah on their own. But many in Lid were killed. So anyway, I'm giving you these as examples. And this is not a recent memory. This is not something that happened historically or biblically or in the Old Testament. This is something that is ongoing, that is shaping not just our past, but our present and our future, and the future of our children. When they take away and confiscate the IDs of our children, like my two daughters, what they're doing is depriving us of our right to live as a family, of my right to have my daughters with me, of my right to live with my grandchildren, so it's very personal to all of us. It's a living thing. And we don't believe that you can choose one period in history 2,000 years ago and say, this is how I want to recreate reality. Otherwise, why not, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, even the pharaohs, the ancient Egyptians were in Palestine. The Romans, the Greeks were in Palestine, the Moabites, the Edomites. Why choose one period, and it's a brief period in the history of Palestine, and attempt to recreate it and call it return? Return where? Really? So if you bring God into the picture, then we said that guarantees that there will be no solution, because gods have a way of not compromising with each other. If you want a Jewish God to compete with the Christian God or with the Muslim God, and if they claim that God gave them rights and absolute rights, then everybody else can claim that our God gave us absolute right. I represent the oldest Christian tradition in the world. Who can tell me that I have no history and no rights in Palestine? This is my identity. And so, yes, this is something that is very existential to us. It's not political, it's not legal, it's not even just human, it's everything. It's existential, and it's the essence of our very being. Now, when Israel legislated a couple of years ago, José, they legislated the nation-state law. It was a very clear case of legalized discrimination, because in that law they said that only Jews have the right to self-determination in the land of Israel. And when they say Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, they mean all of historical Palestine. Okay? So they gave themselves the right to discriminate. They gave themselves, if any other country in the world said only Christians have the right to self-determination, or only Muslims, or only Buddhists even, there would be a tremendous uproar in the world. But when it comes to Israel, its sins are forgiven. It can act with full impunity. It can legislate for racist discrimination, and it can get away with it. Now you hear this again from the Americans, it's the Jewish state. I thought states don't have religions. I thought we wanted a state. Palestine has always been pluralistic and inclusive. It has always been Muslim majority, Christian second, and Jews third. But Palestinians always lived within a framework of tolerance and a rich history and so on. Only when Zionism came and attempted to claim absolutist possession and exclusionist ideologies did we end up with this situation. And when Trump, now there are many people, yes, I'm glad that the issue of the refugees is coming out. because for a long time, yes, it was taboo. If you ever mentioned the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, you are immediately accused of trying to destroy the state of Israel. And that became, a way of shutting people up. It's a taboo. You cannot mention the right of return. All other refugees in the world have the right to return to their homes from which they were expelled, except for the Palestinians, because Israel cannot take it. It bothers Israel, even though there are resolutions like 194 that talks about the right of return, and even 181 does, and there are international agreements and legislation that define the right of return. So what Israel has done was to create a law of return legislation, which means anybody who's Jewish anywhere in the world can come and instantly become an Israeli and get citizenship and get rights and get land. Many of them, stolen from the Palestinians. While any Palestinian who's been there, who lived there, families who were expelled, who trace their lineage hundreds of years, who have property, they cannot return at all, even though international law says they should have the right to return. So you see the difference. In 1950, they legislated a bizarre law called the Absentee Property Law. After they expelled the Palestinians, after they terrorized them, after they uprooted them, then they took over their property and confiscated it under what they call the absentee law because they were absent. Now these Palestinians were not absent because they chose to be absent, they were expelled, they were dispossessed. And then the law was expanded to say those who are living in a hostile country cannot return. What do you mean? Because the refugees were expelled to Jordan, to Lebanon, some to Egypt. They were dispersed all over the world. What hostile countries? And they're not citizens of any other country. They are Palestinians. And they were also, they took refuge in countries that were not very open. In many cases, like in Lebanon, they had no rights whatsoever. And the host country was not very welcoming. So that's the thing. Then in 1970, they legislated a law, what they call property law, in which if any Jew had lived in any house anywhere in Jerusalem or that, then they have the right to claim it back. Even though when you look at the Sheikh Jarrah, before 48, it was empty land. Now they claim, no, there were Jews living there. They were living out in the open on empty land. And if they were living there, they were Palestinians then. There was no Israel. There were Palestinians living there. But at the same time, the Jordanians have the property law because, ironically, these are the people of Sheikh Jarrah who were expelled from their homes in 1948 in West Jerusalem or other places. And when they took refuge in Sheikh Jarrah, the Jordanian government later on built these homes and gave them the land deeds so they could live there. So this is, it's not a dispute over what we call real estate, as they said. It's a real estate dispute. No, this is a very symptomatic and cruel way in which they're attempting to continue the displacement replacement paradigm, to continue the expulsion of Palestinians by any means in order to replace them with Israeli Jews. Now, people like Peter Beinart and Nathan Thrall are very, very important scholars and very important voices of, not just of conscience, but of courage, because there are people who know what's happening in the same way as people like Ilan Pape or Avi Shlaim, the new historians who wrote about this, who exposed the tragedy of 1947-48, of the expulsion and so on, and of the systematic targeting of Palestinians. They are challenging the status quo. They are challenging the prevailing narrative. And they are saying that the only way you can have a real solution is if you have a just solution for the Palestinians, starting with the root causes, not dealing with the symptoms, not dealing with only the last or the latest episode of injustice, but let's look comprehensively at the whole situation. Let's look at the plight of the Palestinians and when it started. We, again, I keep saying, we did not choose to have Israel be created and imposed on Palestinian land. We did not choose to have enemies. We were living, my parents and grandparents and ancestors were living in peace on their own land. Although, I mean, not so much in peace because we've been under colonial rule, whether it's from the days of the Ottomans to the British mandate, and then to the Israeli occupation. But in many ways, this has become an issue that will continue to fester, a wound, not just for Palestinians, but for the region and even for the world, because it's such a clear case of an ongoing injustice, criminality, and the powerful party, the occupier, enjoys full immunity to act with impunity, without any accountability. So the two-state solution is not, frankly, I don't want to talk about Trump because that would take me ages, because Trump was doing the dirty work of the most extreme right-wing, racist, violent Israeli government in history. They removed the term occupation from the political discourse. They totally dropped it. They decided settlements are legal, contrary to international law. They allowed Israel to annex Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, which is entirely illegal. They tried to deliver the Arab countries to Israel to normalize and turn Israel, reposition Israel into the region as a major economic, political, military, intelligence power. And they're doing this, and they try to do it by trying to bash the Palestinians into submission, by trying to defeat the Palestinians, as they said, because they know that we want our rights and that we are a challenge to all the illegalities and injustices that Israel is doing. Anyway, and he targeted the refugees because he said he had to redefine refugees. UNRWA is an international organization set up in 1951. It was set up earlier when Israel refused to allow them to return. They established the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in order to provide services and protect the lives of Palestinian refugees until they return. And now the Israelis said there's no need for UNRWA because they want to totally dissipate the Palestinian refugee question. And because Trump wanted to destroy an organization that was established by the UN, not by us, not by the US. He has no right to destroy it. So he decided to defund UNRWA and he attacked it, and they started a campaign. And they started a campaign to redefine Palestinian refugee as those who are surviving from 1948, but not their children or grandchildren. So how many people, who were expelled in 48 are still alive? So they said, no, we don't have 5.5 million registered refugees. We have only 40,000. So this is one way in which they attempted to accommodate Israel. Another way, they did more than even the extremist government in Israel wanted. And so they attempted to destroy the two-state solution. And they had no other alternative except they said that ours is an economic issue. All they needed was to give us a few handouts, a few dollars, and we will accept our fate in captivity and under subjugation. This showed not just extreme bias, but it showed extreme ignorance and irresponsibility. And it was a very dangerous period in which they tried to pass bills in Congress, they tried to create facts that are irreversible, and now we are really desperately trying to undo all this damage and trying to challenge this American administration not to pursue these policies, but to begin to undo them and reverse this process of destruction. Professor. Now, finally, the two-state solution, yes. We did not choose the two-state solution. In 1968-69, I remember I was a member of the General Union of Palestine students then, and the proposal by Fatah and by the PLO was the one democratic, non-sectarian or secular state in Palestine, where Christian, Muslim, Jew, atheist, whatever can live together in peace and equality. This was immediately shut down because the Zionist movement from the beginning wanted exclusively Jewish states, a Jewish state. And that kind of presentation was not picked up. Now, with the current dynamic, it's become clear that the expansion of settlements, the land theft, where Israel now is claiming more than 60% of the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, as you know, the West Bank, it's Israel is occupying, let's say, 22% of historical Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. And it is on 78% of historical Palestine. It was recognized. So now they want to see how much further they can annex, how much further they can go. They've illegally annexed Jerusalem and environment. They have created huge clusters of settlements in Ma'ale Adumim and Gush Etzion and Ariel in the north to fragment the West Bank and prevent the emergence of any kind of territorially contiguous or viable Palestinian state. And now they are pursuing this. Now they're saying Area C, I don't want to go into that, have to be under Israeli sovereignty, or we can stay without any political rights, but they might consider civil rights. That's not the one-state solution. What they're creating is a de facto apartheid state, and it has become clear now. For years, for decades, actually since '48, they have been discriminating against the indigenous Palestinians who remained in Palestine when it became Israel. We call them the 48 Palestinians, in the sense that in 1948 they stayed in Palestine, and they were subjected to the most horrific discriminatory system in education, in health, in work, in whatever. And in the economy, of course, you know, there were many, many areas of specialization in universities that they weren't allowed to study, for example. And they confiscated all the lands. They used to own 94% of the land. And now they're left with 3% of the land. And this is what Israel is doing. That's why it has this voracious appetite to take the land of the West Bank. In order to expand and in order to create greater Israel on all of historical Palestine. So when you make the two-state solution impossible, and when the world sits back, including the EU and the US and others, and say, no, we are for the two-state solution, so we're good people. So why did you sit back and allow Israel to destroy it? Why didn't you take up clear measures to prevent Israel from land confiscation, from the theft of our land and resources, from committing the war crime, which of course the ICC, the International Criminal Court, defines as a war crime in accordance to the Rome Statute, of building settlements. These are colonies. And clearly Israel is acting, to all of us, is acting like a colonial outpost, the colonial outpost that it was when it was created by the will of the Western powers. That this is really not an organic indigenous reality, that this is a settler colonial enterprise that is on the ground, expanding, expelling people, taking their lands, demolishing homes, as you know, and then they talk about, well, there has to be a peaceful solution only when they finish imposing superimposing greater Israel on all of historical Palestine. So the one-state solution is going to emerge de facto. and it is emerging at a very great expense and a lot of pain for the Palestinian people who are losing their lands and their lives and their homes. You saw how now there is tremendous unity among the Palestinian people everywhere. In Jerusalem, where this latest episode started, when they targeted Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they shot tear gas canisters and stun grenades inside the mosque, where they targeted the old city of Jerusalem and Damascus Gate and so on, where they targeted Sheikh Jarrah, where they targeted the Easter procession on Palm Sunday and on Easter Sunday in the old city. So it's like they challenged, they provoked the Palestinians beyond endurance. And Hamas and the other factions warned Israel repeatedly. They said, stop, you're playing with fire. You are provoking everybody. And they didn't listen. And they said, then they gave them a deadline. And they said, if you don't stop this assault on Jerusalem and our holy sites, that we will have to respond. And they didn't stop, they escalated. So they responded. And when they responded, everybody, Israel and its allies started talking about how, this is Hamas, and Hamas is bombarding Israel with rockets. So they managed to turn the situation upside down and to claim that they are the victims again, and to try to maintain this pattern of behavior, which has succeeded in the long term, but will not succeed anymore, because people have access to facts. People all over the world have access to knowledge, and knowledge is a responsibility. It is not just power. And we are now developing, I'm seeing this really, it's very encouraging, I would say. We are seeing a solidarity network emerging all over the world from people of conscience, whatever religion, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, people who are standing up in defense of Palestinian rights, people who are breaking taboos about Palestine and saying, even in Congress, that Palestine has to be free. And there are people, whether they're minorities or whether they're universities and academic circles, or whether they are even circles and so on. You're seeing Black Lives Matter and so on. Even the churches network in the States. There are lots of people now who are challenging the distortions and the lies that Israel is perpetuating, distort the Palestinian reality and justify their...
Professor, if I can...
So now...
Yep, sorry.
I'm sorry. So now Israel has succeeded in exposing what an apartheid state it is with this latest assault.
Right.
And has brought all the Palestinian people together. There are demonstrations everywhere, in Europe, in the States, in the Arab world, in 48 Palestine, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, everywhere. There's a unity now. The Palestinian people are rising. It's not just an uprising, they are rising with confidence, with courage. The new generation is saying, this is it, we have had it. And we will not take it anymore. And we will defy, we will challenge, and we will expose Israel's measures and provocations and policies on the ground. And that is a signal of a new phase. It's a new phase, I think.
Indeed.
And for the first time, Israel is learning that there is a price to be paid, that the Palestinians will stand up to it, that even though governments are in collusion in many cases, and international multilateral organizations are helpless, but the Palestinian people and their allies are not. And this is a significant, really historical turning point. It really is a paradigm shift.
Indeed. What we've seen is, thank you for that, Professor Ashrawi. What we've seen, to continue talking about the current developments on the ground, what we've seen is dramatic, and I wonder whether you said it's a turning point, which was my next question. Again, I think you should also underline what has been, in many ways, the erasure of the green line that we were talking about, that is bringing back the conflict from the 1967 border to 1948. We saw that with the rebellions, the revolts, the protests inside in mixed cities, Palestinian, Israeli cities within Israel, and the way that there was that solidarity between Palestinians, citizens of Israel, and the West Bank and Gaza, which was in many respects not completely unprecedented, of course, because it happened at the beginning of the second Intifada. But what we've also seen, which is very interesting, is that the legacy of the administration of Donald Trump, the so-called Abraham Accords, and how they were going to usher a new phase of the conflict. And in many ways, we've seen this has proven wrong the idea that that those very fundamental questions can be left unaddressed. The paradigm that the Prime Minister Netanyahu was trying to impose of peace in exchange for peace, that is to make no concessions in exchange for peace. We've seen a reawakening of the Arab street. We've seen protests across the Arab world. So in many ways, this has sort of a lot of feelings have flown over, really have been unleashed. A lot of all the frustration, really, that we've been witnessing in recent years of all the process of the further annexation of the de facto annexation of the West Bank, expansion of the settlements, enormous brutality of settlers, those images that are being recorded almost on a daily basis of Jewish settlers attacking Palestinian farmers, and then most recently in Jerusalem. And in this context, it's at the same time, there are some, I think, concerns about what's happening internally for the Palestinians. I think that Hamas in this sense acted very opportunistically, and it used the moment in ways that were totally unexpected, that they would react in this way, responding to those abuses in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram al-Sharif. So Hamas was responding to that, and it really claimed for itself the leadership of the Palestinian nationalist movement, and has really gathered, I'm sure, enormous support in this leadership. Because of all these years, the hand that was stretched, and that had been very clearly stretched since the Madrid conference, Abbas is an extremely moderate leader in the whole of history of the Palestinian nationalist movement, extremely eager to continue on the negotiations, actually was able to gain no traction. And so really the Palestinian Authority was kind of left helpless in the face of all these constant violations. And Hamas really seems to have picked up the gauntlet. But of course, what does that mean? And also, in terms of internally, again, on the Palestinian arena, the question of Palestinian elections, and the fact that Palestinians were on the road to elections, on the path to elections. They would have happened, what was it, the 22nd, in 5 days from now, we would have had elections. They were cancelled because Israel was not given the green light for elections in Jerusalem, though of course many people argue that the leadership, that President Abbas should have waited a little bit longer, should have pushed longer. There was strong criticism from the European Union to the Palestinian leadership for cancelling those elections preemptively. And we can even make the argument, can't we, that if Hamas had participated in those elections, if elections were still on track, perhaps we wouldn't have seen this spike in the violence because there would have still been some sort of political horizon for them to play the political game. So in many ways, disastrous, the fact that the Palestinians weren't able to hold elections have been disastrous consequences, inevitably, particularly in Gaza. Enormous damage, also in Israel, of course. The enormous, great suffering there. So, but you have to wonder what would have happened where had elections taken place, and more generally, when the Palestinians are going to be able to reconcile internally, Hamas and Fatah, the West Bank and Gaza. Increasingly, we hear that Israel, the Human Rights Watch, established in its report that Israel was committing the crime of apartheid. But some people are saying, if we draw the comparison with South Africa, Palestinians no longer have an ANC. You yourself, Professor Ashrawi, stepped down, perhaps I think the first person ever possibly to step down from the executive committee of the PLO back in December. There is a lot of pending issues internally for Palestinians. So I'd like you, if possible, to address those two questions. What does this mean, this news escalation, this really the fourth war on Gaza? What are we going to see now after this? With this incredible rise, clearly proven wrong, the legacy of the Trump administration, and that, or most probably proving wrong that the legacy of the Trump administration, that the Abraham Accords were going to completely change the paradigm. We've seen that the underlying issues are very relevant still. The Palestinian question is very much unresolved. The question of Gaza is still very much unresolved. The siege of Gaza, the suffering, enormous suffering, 15 years under siege. So all those questions still very much unresolved. The new paradigm, supposedly new paradigm, not working. And Hamas suddenly receiving, making this an extremely popular move for a lot of people in Palestine and in the Middle East, in many ways taking on the leadership of the Palestinian movement. What does that mean? And then, what internally, the question of the al-Bayt al-Dakhili, the internal, the house, the Palestinian house, all the pending questions that you know so well.
It's extremely painful that for such a long time, since 2007, we have had an internal rift, this division, as you said, between Hamas and Fatah, or the PLO factions. And it remained as a source of weakness for the Palestinian cause. And of course, it was exploited to avoid any dealing with the Palestinians as one entity, even though the PLO was supposed to be the one address representing Palestinians everywhere. But I don't want to go into that because it's too long and complicated. There were many attempts to try to resolve this rift and to reunite, and it didn't work for many reasons, whether it's privilege or benefit or accession to power or external intervention. We had many countries intervene. It's not just domestic, as you know. There were people funding and helping, standing with one side as opposed to the other. There were Arab countries and non-Arab countries intervening, and the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. But the thing is, with the elections, there was a real chance that you could have a democratic way of creating an inclusive, pluralistic system. Because when you have elections, you can let the people choose, right? And it was such a moment of exhilaration among the Palestinians. They were so excited to have elections. We had 36 electoral lists or slates registering for elections, many of them young men and women, beautiful people who were sick and tired of the same old tired factional politics, divisions, and people who, to be very blunt, corruption, and people who were abusing their position and so on. Our whole political system atrophied, and we saw an erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms. We saw people who felt entitled to power and benefit and so on. We saw the exclusion of 2 generations, not just one. We saw the exclusion of women as well and marginalization. And I was struggling in order to have these young men and women who are infused with energy, with foresight, smart, bearing young people who should have their turn, and they were let down. And as you said, the postponement, so-called, indefinitely of the elections came as a big sense of, I don't want to say betrayal, but disappointment, that having all tried their best to register their electoral lists, 1,389 people registered to run, 405 women. That's amazing. And in addition, to the fact that they were preparing a new discourse, new political approaches. But for a long time, the PLO has been weakening, or has been weakened gradually, has been marginalized. The PA, which is supposedly the administrative, functional sort of institutional setup to provide services for the people, has been strengthened, and they took over the role of the PLO. And absent elections, of course, there was no change. And that created a political dysfunction as well. So with the elections, Hamas, if you look at the public opinion polls, nobody would have had a majority, which was very good. We were happy with that, because neither Fatah will maintain its control, along with its few minuscule parties and factions, nor Hamas would gain a majority control. So there will have to be a coalition system, which is good. But when Fatah, in a sense, had divided itself into 3, with the Dahlan group and with Nasser and Marwan and with mainstream Fatah, and they saw that they will lose their majority control, they were quite alarmed. Not only President Abbas, but also some Arab countries, and also Israel, and also indirectly the Americans. Now, the Europeans had been pushing for elections, and we kept telling them, you have to put pressure on Israel to allow elections, or not to prevent elections in Jerusalem, because nobody will accept to relinquish Jerusalem, that's it. And they said, we can't do anything until the president issues a decree. So Mahmoud Abbas issued the decree. They went to Israel and said, let's have elections, allow elections in Jerusalem. Israel said no. They didn't even allow their elections expert team to come in. And the Europeans sat back. I said, what do you mean? You just sat back and accepted being told, no, you have no business here? I mean, you have power. Use your power. You are Israel's greatest economic partner. Use that power. Anyway, they didn't. I don't want to go into too many details, but let's put it that way. Had elections taken place, it would have been the beginning of domestic change towards a really inclusive, diverse political system. It would have reinvigorated, re-legitimized our political system. Not having elections created even more anger. And given the fact that since the PLO committed to a negotiated peaceful settlement, until now, we lost more land, we lost more resources, we lost more lives. Israel continued its expansion. Israel created this horrific apartheid system. And nobody supported the agenda of the negotiated settlement or two-state solution, except, saying we still support the two-state solution. We want a negotiated settlement. And they saw that reality on the ground was not supporting this vision. Israel was destroying this vision. And then they'd say, we want a negotiated settlement. Well, we negotiated since 1991, since Madrid, 30 years. And we went to Madrid with hope, with enthusiasm, with confidence. We were addressing the world. We were putting Palestine on the map. We were going to end this occupation and give hope and create stability. Instead, we ended up paying the price of this total collusion with Israel, this enablement of a lawless system, a rogue state, and of course, this total disregard of Palestinian rights, because we got no protection, as according to international law. What is the role of the UN, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and so on, is to protect the vulnerable, the victim, and to curb the violations of the powerful and the aggressor. And they didn't. And so that agenda that the PLO adopted since 1988 was exposed as being non-functional. It wasn't delivered. And with it, the national leadership was gradually being weakened, and it lost support. And that's why there was a gap between the people and the leadership, because you adopted the two-state solution, you adopted the peaceful resolution, you adopted the negotiated settlement, you negotiated ad nauseum. Not only did you get nothing, the situation got much worse. In the meantime, Hamas could easily claim that they are the resistance. They are the people who stand up to Israel. They are the people who maintain the pride of Palestine. Now, there are many people I know who totally disagree with Hamas, ideologically, politically. And yet, they support Hamas's move now, because they feel for a change, we have a sense of pride, even though it's painful. For a change, Palestinians dare to stand up to Israel in the language that Israel knows best, frankly. And when there were demonstrations in the old city, in Jerusalem, in Damascus Gate, and they were calling on Hamas to strike. Can you imagine that? So that's what happened. But I'll tell you something. Hamas, yes, is more popular now. And our leadership, the national leadership is seen to be more and more irrelevant. But who is running the street? It's the young people. Tomorrow, there is a total strike in 48 Palestine, in Gaza, in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and in Palestinians elsewhere. This is a place among Palestinians elsewhere. This is one expression of national popular unity among the people everywhere under occupation, under an apartheid system in Gaza, Jerusalem, and West Bank, and in exile and as refugees. The exiles and the refugees are also joining in this. So the people took matters into their own hand. The leadership is losing credibility, and the young people in particular decided, no, we will work together. And of course, they've been facilitated by the social media and the networks. I read them, I speak to many of them, and I feel just incredibly proud of these young people who said, we don't want typical leadership, neither Hamas nor Fatah nor anybody. We want to create our own agenda. And this is what they're doing. So this is a significant transformation, Jose. It's not something to be frowned at, particularly when, as you talked about the so-called Abraham Accords, and I hate that name, frankly, because it evokes religious connotations and biblical connotations, which are entirely counterproductive. What Trump wanted to do was marginalize the Palestinians, reposition Israel, as I told you, in the heart of the Arab world as a major power, give it all the rewards at once, deliver Palestine to Israel, and then say, that's it. You know, we've solved this. This is important. It backfired because now Arabs all over the Arab world, the public of people who normalized with Israel, the people are out in the streets demonstrating in thousands and thousands in support of Palestine and the Palestinian people. So the gap between the people and the regimes is increasing as well. So what they thought they could do is reorganize the region according to Israel's preferences and priorities, ended up creating a situation of greater instability. And it exposed these regimes, again, as trying to normalize the abnormal, trying to normalize oppression, trying to normalize land theft, home demolitions, killing, expulsions, and so on. You can't normalize these things.
Professor,
and the Arab people
if I can interrupt you? I'm sorry.
So,
yep.
yeah.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? We're just running out of time, I'm afraid, and I really wanted to see if there's somebody in the audience that had a burning question that they might want to pose to you. Just a very quick, short question. Apologies for interrupting you, but perhaps somebody here. No. Sorry.
You ask long questions. The questions are short, but the answers are long.
Is anybody in the audience here have a question at all? We'll make a statement. Before I pass you on to, you would like to make a question to Professor Hanan? A statement?
Yeah, it's a short one.
Okay.
Doctora, I think the elections essential for Palestine. It's very important, and we did our best with all Europeans, and I myself participate in this. And our foreign minister, he visited most of the European countries. Our president, he called most of the European leaders, and even the United States, and everyone, even the Arabs, to make the elections going on. And I think we did something never happened in history, that 93% of the people whom they have the right to vote, they register their names. And exactly. We have 36 lists for the elections. We want the elections to take place. But unfortunately, the Israelis, they don't want. And they said that, we don't have government. They have government to decide settlements, but they don't have government to say yes for the elections. For us, if we set the elections without Jerusalem, I think it will be understood in a wrong way from the Israeli side that Palestinian under pressure can accept the Trump administration decision that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. We will never do so. We still want the elections, and we ask the Europeans later on, please do your best, please work more with the Israelis, and we can do it next week, the elections. We are already ready. Only we need to guarantee that the elections will help in all Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, according to the agreement that we signed with them in 1995. And we have 3 elections before, and Palestinians in Jerusalem, they participate. And we want the people in Jerusalem to participate again. We need the elections. It is so essential for our system, for our relations with the whole world. And the Europeans, unfortunately, they are our neighbors, our friends, and they did not do what they're supposed to do. They can make pressure on the Israelis, while the Americans are still in the first of their mandate, Biden. And his priorities is different. But the Europeans, they can do. And they still can do if they want to make a pressure on the Israelis to respect the agreement we have signed with them in 1995 and to have elections everywhere. And we are ready, as we did in 2006, we are ready to accept the results of the elections where our people can choose their leadership.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, nobody wanted elections without Jerusalem. And yes, almost 94% registered. That shows you how enthusiastic people are for democracy, for elections, for a change, in the political system. But the problem is that the promises given to us were not fulfilled. that they will put pressure on Israel and so on to enable. But there were two schools of thought, very frankly. There was one school of thought that said no elections without Jerusalem, and there was another school of thought that said we will have elections with Jerusalem. So there were the younger people, and most of the lists, including your daughter, Kifah, whom I love dearly, they wanted to have elections and they wanted to challenge Israel on the issue of Jerusalem. If the whole world couldn't put pressure on Israel to enable us to have elections in Jerusalem, then let's make that a point of confrontation. We will defy, we will go there, we will take the ballot boxes, we will go from place to place. We let them run after us, let them try to stop us, let the world see them running after ballot boxes, after young people who want to run, after people who want to vote, who want to exercise their democratic rights. Let's make elections a challenge and a means of resistance and exposing Israel's undemocratic and corrosive and oppressive system. So yes, but now reality has superseded elections. Had we had elections, as Jose said, then the situation of frustration and anger would have probably dissipated. People would have felt that they are in charge of their own fate, so to speak. But now add all of these things together, this anger, this sense of frustration and so on, add to it the pain of being under Israeli assault, and of course the supreme challenge, the provocation of attacking the Haram Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, of attacking the processions on Easter, Christian processions, of trying to kick Palestinians out. All these things came to a head, and people just had enough. That's why I'm saying there's a new dynamic, Ya Kifah, it's new. And people are extremely confident. They are fearless. I see them. I walk, I see them. It's close to my house, Beitir. And you know what? They are facing fully armed soldiers. And they are challenging them. And they are saying, that's it, we want to be free. 200 checkpoints in the West Bank are now seeing confrontations, Israeli army, settlers shooting. They killed over 20 people, 21 I think, people, and they wounded 4,000 people. And they're using live ammunition, and the wounds are not like the Israelis say somebody panicked or somebody fell running to a shelter. These are people who were shot, and many people who have permanent injuries and so on, like in Gaza, which is a clear disaster, tragic area. So I'm saying maybe reality has overtaken, has superseded the same old language of the leadership, frankly speaking. I think unless the leadership learns that they have to share power, relinquish power, respect the people, and deal with them and respect their rights, they also will be superseded by the people, which is what's happening. The young people are taking matters into their own hands. Yes, we didn't have elections, but we are the activists. We have our allies. We have our agenda. I mean, whoever called for the massive strike tomorrow were the young people. And it started with 48 Palestine and was picked up even by the Fatah Shabibi and by the young organizations here, the Jil al-Jadid, you know, and people like that, because they said we can formulate our own agenda. And ours now is an agenda of struggle, of defiance. And I see them, and I worry about them because I know they're facing a brutal, ruthless enemy, armed enemy. But we've been there. You've been there. We have faced armed soldiers. I personally was beaten up. I was detained. I was prevented from running my campaign in Jerusalem. They confiscated my material. repeatedly we were detained and so on, and repeatedly we were beaten up. And I really don't know how I survived. Sometimes my daughters say they're amazed that I faced so many people shooting at us and so on. And it was our time. Now it is their time. And they want to be instruments of change. And I'm very optimistic. I think that they can. And Israel, as I said, has exposed itself to the world as the brutal, violent, racist, exclusionary and apartheid state. It is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and ultimately the ICC and other instruments and institutions of accountability will have to hold it to account.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Ashrawi, for having accepted to commemorate this 73rd anniversary of the Nakba with us today, with Casa Árabe. Thank you for your very frank comments on the current situation. Let's hope that a ceasefire that puts an end to the current crisis will soon be reached, that the elections that have only been postponed will take place on the coming weeks or months rather. And let's hope that the peace process that, as we have seen in these last few days, is the only alternative, the only realistic alternative to the current state in Palestinian and Israel as well, because it will benefit to both communities. Let's hope that it will be on track soon as well. I would like to finally to thank the ambassadors for having of Egypt, Algeria, and the Palestinian ambassador, and the ambassador of Qatar. Sorry, I didn't recognize you with the mask. Excuse me, ambassador. Thank you all for having accompanied us today, and thank you to all our listeners on our YouTube channel as well. I wish you a very good afternoon and hope to see you soon back in Casa Árabe. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much. Thank you.